Well, Krish, more and more people arriving here by the minute. These are the counter-protesters. I saw a couple of women just now with signs saying "Nans against Nazis." They're here because this is one of the sites, around 100 or so sites, where police have said that they have real concerns about what might potentially happen here later this evening. There are also a lot of police in this area this evening, with riot vans patrolling the streets around here, large groups of officers on street corners telling people to take off their face coverings as they walk past. And you can see they boarded up the windows here. This is one of the places where there are concerns. Largely, it's immigration centres and lawyers' offices there are concerns about. But you mentioned what happened in court earlier, and I was there as those sentences were handed out and as a man was jailed for 3 years. Southport last week, when the understandable anger felt by many, for some, became an illogical excuse for this. Among the 1,000 or so in the crowd, this man, Derek Drummond, 58 years old and today jailed for 3 years for his part in the violent disorder and for punching a police officer in the face. What we saw here in court today was not just fast-tracked justice. It was also justice meant to send out a message. On the violence in Southport last week, just a day after the knife attack at a dance class in which 3 young girls were killed, the judge said that the genuine and collective grief in the town was effectively hijacked. He described the rioters as a large and utterly lawless mob and said, quite simply, those who deliberately participate in such disorder, causing injury, damage and fear to communities, will inevitably be punished with sentences designed to deter others. From Southport, the violence spread like a wildfire, flaring up in more towns and cities, fueled by online influencers and agitators making false claims about the nationality, ethnicity and religion of the alleged attacker in the Southport stabbing. Claims that are nonsense, it was said in court today. Alongside Derek Drummond in the dock, Declan Gearan, who tried to set fire to a police van, and Liam Riley, part of a group throwing bricks in the centre of Liverpool at the weekend. He then made racist comments to police. When arrested, Gearan and Riley both claimed they were there to show support for the grieving families in Southport.
The 3 men sentenced today are the tip of the iceberg and just the start of what will be a very painful process for many who foolishly chose to involve themselves in violent unrest. The disturbing images we've seen across the country, manipulated by agitators both in person and online, while local families still grieve the loved ones, is an unforgivable and selfish act that each and every person sentenced today will have to live with.
With more arrests each day, we can expect more long prison sentences and also more police.
And we've seen officers across the country, haven't we, facing really challenging violence and situations.
Including these officers from the Met heading to the north of England to bolster resources. There are questions too about the policing response, with claims of 2-tier policing and coming down harder on some factions than others.
It's complete nonsense. We have commentators from either end of the political spectrum who like to throw accusations of bias at the police. The serious voices who echo those are of more concern to me, because the risk is they legitimise it and they legitimise the violence that the officers I'm sending on mutual aid today will face on the streets. They are putting them at risk by suggesting that any of those officers are going out with any intent other than to operate without fear or favour in protecting communities.
Communities where this evening there are more patrols and more measures being taken, with intelligence said to be credible that there could be more to come.
Claire Fallon there. Well, what role do politicians have in shaping and responding to the violence? Tory leadership hopeful Robert Jenrick sparked outrage today by suggesting people should be immediately arrested if they shout Allahu Akbar, the Arabic phrase meaning God is great, comments which were criticised across the political divide. Here's our senior political correspondent, Paul McNamara.
It's a phrase we've heard plenty of over the last few years.
Stop the boats. Stop the boats. Stop the boats.
Rishi Sunak has condemned the riots of the last week, calling it violent criminal behaviour with no place in British society. On febrile streets, though, words matter. This afternoon, the former Immigration Minister and current Conservative leadership hopeful Robert Jenrick was asked about what's been called two-tier policing for recent events. These were his words.
Well, I have been very critical of the police in the past, particularly around the attitude of some police forces to the protests that we saw since October the 7th. You know, I thought it was quite wrong that somebody could shout
What about the
Allah
last 8 or 9
Akbar
days?
on the streets of London and not be immediately arrested, or project genocidal chants onto Big Ben and that person not be immediately arrested.
Critics quickly condemned Mr Jenrick, pointing out that Allahu Akbar means God is great in Arabic and is commonly used during prayer.
Hello, everyone.
Later, Mr Jenrick posted this video as evidence of those he says he was talking about, while appearing to row back, saying Allahu Akbar is spoken peacefully and spiritually by millions of British Muslims in their daily lives.
People like Robert Jenrick has been stirring up some of the problems that we've seen in our communities. Actually, what we want to see is that communities coming together, and vast majority of the public want to see that.
Up until 3 days ago, this hotel housed asylum seekers. Up until, that is, 700 people gathered outside the Holiday Inn Express in Rotherham and tried to set fire to it. Immigration, rioters claim, is their reason for violence over the last week. But it's an issue which has been at the forefront of British politics for years. Polling by YouGov shows only 7% of the public support recent riots. As to the reasons for the riots, though, over the last few years we've seen an awful lot of rhetoric on immigration policy. Are people blaming that at all for what they're seeing play out on the streets?
Yeah, so immigration policy is up there as one of the things they're blaming for it. And if you look down party lines, we're seeing, Conservatives blaming the Labour government, we're seeing Labour blaming the Conservative government, and then it's your Reform voters that are really looking at immigration policy. And in fact, we've seen immigration soar to the top of our most important issues now.
As the government calls for calm, protest, counter-protest and riots to end, the message is actions will be prosecuted and words matter.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Cabinet Office Minister, Nick Thomas-Symonds, and I started by asking him how the government plans to end this unrest.
Anyone who engages in this violent and thuggish behaviour will feel the full force of the law. And I think we've seen that today. Sentences of 20 months, of 2.5 years and 3 years handed down to 3 men who engaged in this violent, thuggish behaviour only 8 days ago. That is the consequence of engaging in this violent and thuggish behaviour. Secondly, we are clear with communities we will be doing all we can to protect them.
But is the cause racism or is it immigration? Because, there are lots of people on the right out there saying, well, underneath all of this is dissatisfaction with levels of immigration. And on the other hand, there are lots of people saying the problem is there's a lot of racists out there.
Well, I was going up and down the country, not just in the weeks before the general election, but in the months before as well. I spoke to many people with concerns about a variety of issues, including immigration, decent, law-abiding people who wouldn't dream of taking part in this violent and thuggish behaviour. And what you have here, you have these thugs engaging in this appalling behaviour. And of course, they are communicating, groups are communicating on social media as well.
Your colleague, the Deputy Prime Minister, has accused the man who wants to lead the Conservative Party, Robert Jenrick, of stirring up a lot of the problems that we're seeing in communities. Could you just explain what the government means by this? What are you accusing him of?
Well, evidently, politicians of all political parties, of course, are responsible for their language and being responsible about the use of language. But what the government's focus is this evening, let there be no doubt about it, is firstly to send out a very clear message that anyone who engages in this appalling, thuggish, violent behaviour will feel the full force of the law. And as we've shown today,
but can we address these questions?
Just one more.
That's the third time you told me that. So I mean,
Krishnan, just one final point I just wanted to add to that, because where there are particular concerns, for example, around mosques, the government has a particular programme, a fund available, and if there are particular concerns, the government will make additional security available. And I appreciate you just giving me the chance to say that, because I think it's important.
The trouble is, what happens when this is over, isn't it? You know, what happens when you quell this round of rioting? You know, how do you ensure this doesn't happen again? And that's why people are saying, you've got to start addressing what are the underlying causes, whatever they may be.
It's a mistake to conflate genuine concerns people have, whether it's on the level of immigration, whether it's on socio-economic issues, whether it's on our public services, with people who are going out for no other reason other than to commit mindless violence. And for them, what is crucial is that we set out the strongest of responses, and that's what we're doing.
So how can you reach Andrew Tate or Tommy Robinson or, frankly, Elon Musk now, all of whom are amplifying misinformation?
Well, look, there is, of course, a need to keep the online safety laws that we have under review. And there are, as you quite rightly point out, Krishnan, those various aspects and challenges around that. But whatever the position of the platform, people who put content on the platform are themselves responsible for their actions. So somebody who puts something that is itself committing a criminal offence on the platform will be pursued by our police. The armchair thugs, if you like, will be pursued just as much as the thugs on our streets.
Even if there isn't more violence tonight, the job of that sort of threat has already had a chilling effect on society. You know, people have stayed at home, businesses have closed up early. There is a terrorising effect of these threats.
Well, look, let's just take this step by step. First of all, of course, businesses have been hugely affected by this, and lives of people who've been victims of this disorder, it's been quite appalling. In terms of the second point that you're making, if people are making threats, whether they are making threats on our streets, whether they're making threats individually to people they meet, or indeed whether they are making threats of violence online, all those things are things that break our criminal law, and all those things are things that the action people are taking will mean they feel the full force of the law. Whether it is threats of violence, actual violence, people will feel the full force of the law, and it should make people think twice about acting in this way.
I mean, we all hear you, and ministers have been echoing this, you know, a lot. But Tommy Robinson is sitting there on his sun lounger laughing at you, isn't he? And just sort of doing more of this.
Well, look, you wouldn't, I'm sure, expect me to comment on individual cases, and obviously I wouldn't do that. But the reality is that whoever you are, if you have committed criminal offences, online or offline, you will feel the full force of the law. That is absolutely the government's position. And we've seen evidence of how quickly the government has been acting and pushing this matter, with sentences handed down today after just 8 days after the offences.
Nick Thomas-Symonds, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, let's go to Kieran in Leeds now with more on the scale of the rioting.
Thank you, Krish. So suspected rioters will be appearing in several courts around the country after the wave of racist violence in the last week. And we've been mapping where there's been disorder, which has led to arrests. And this includes far-right rioting in towns and cities, including Liverpool, Plymouth, Manchester, Hartlepool, as well as violent clashes in Middlesbrough. Police, of course, were attacked in Stoke-on-Trent. Rioters tried to set a hotel housing asylum seekers in Rotherham on fire, and buildings were set alight in Belfast. In all, there's been violence or disorder leading to arrests in at least 28 places across England and Northern Ireland since Tuesday last week. Now, so far, Cleveland police have charged the most offenders, 43 across Middlesbrough and Hartlepool. Thousands of police actually are preparing tonight for more potential violence and monitoring at least 100 possible events. A list of possible targets for the far right has been circulated through several apps. Areas listed include Bolton, Oldham, Rotherham, Peterborough and London. Now, these locations include places where immigration lawyers are based, as well as immigration centres. So what about the scale of the criminal justice response? Well, clearly cases are being fast-tracked now for those suspected of disorder. After a week of violence, more than 140 people have been charged, with 428 arrested. And the last time we saw anything like this unrest was in 2011. Now, 6 days after the beginning of those riots in 2011, 1,600 people had been arrested and 796 had appeared in court. Back then, people were still being charged, though, many months after the violence had ended. So there's going to be a lot more people getting a knock on the door in the coming weeks. Krish.
Thanks, Kieran. Well, joining me now is Chief Constable BJ Harrington, Public Order Lead for the National Police Chiefs Council. Can the police cope with this as it carries on? We're more than a week in now.
Yeah, Chris, good evening. And absolutely we can cope with this. We've seen abhorrent violence across the country, in towns, in cities, people destroying communities, attacking communities and attacking police officers, and it's not acceptable. You said yourself in this report tonight, over 400 arrests, over 120 people charged and brought to court, and convictions already, whether people have been abusive online, inciting hatred, or indeed attacking communities and causing damage. Yes, we can. We're prepared this evening. Thousands of officers across the country, specially trained riot officers, ready to deal with disorder, but also community officers out in our communities, working with them to make sure they feel safe and that they are safe.
Now, even our producers on the ground are saying that they're starting to recognise certain faces. I'm sure the police are doing the same. So how much more intelligence is there now in terms of intercepting what's going on?
Well, we're out on the ground, over 100 events that have been discussed this evening. And of course, where there is disorder, we'll be there. We're using intelligence, we're using information and we're gathering evidence, whether that's from online sources, the internet and of course social media, whether that's video and CCTV cameras, whether it's drone footage and the body-worn footage of officers on the ground. So we're using that, we're bringing convictions and I think there's been no shortage of arrests. And when you compare that with 2011, I think we've been much more fleet of foot. And of course, with the support of the courts and the Crown Prosecution Service, we're bringing people in front of the courts and they're getting convicted.
How many people do you think are taking part in this?
I mean, that's difficult to say. You've seen from the media coverage and from the footage across the country that in some places it's large numbers and in some places it's small amounts of people who are congregating and attacking the police. And we've seen some huge success. But I also want to stress that, we've seen some changes. If you look at Southport, following the tragedy of those little girls being killed, they've taken a different approach now. And of course, we've seen communities coming together and working with the police to say that actually not on in our community. And I want to thank those communities that are doing that. In Birmingham, we've seen people protesting and those in a mosque sharing food. So there is a huge amount of cohesion going on. And of course, for the officers and the police officers who are out there, you've seen their bravery, you've seen the things they've been doing. And of course, they're out there to protect the communities. And they care about these communities, unlike some of the people who perhaps from far afield are online trying to stoke up disorder and violence.
Do you think you need to do more as forces to explain your policing tactics in individual cases? I mean, you know that there's a huge amount of misinformation going on about two-tier policing, which is a phrase that's kind of just blown out, pretty much out of nowhere in the last couple of weeks. In the past, two-tier policing might have meant, people making accusations of police racism. Now it's kind of gone the other way, that where you're being accused of policing, white gatherings more harshly than anti-racist protests. I mean, how are you going to tackle that? Because a lot of people clearly believe it, whether it's true or not.
Well, I mean, we police without fear or favour, and where people come out on the streets, they want to come out and protest, and they're peaceful and they're lawful. Policing will and has always facilitated that kind of activity. It's an important part of our democratic society. However, as we have seen in the last week, where people come out to destroy their community, to damage libraries, to smash up shops, to overturn cars and to attack police officers, then that's not two-tier policing, and we will act, we'll make arrests, we'll go forward as you've seen officers bravely doing, and we'll put those people in front of the courts. That's about policing firmly and dealing with criminality.
Chief Constable, thank you very much.
Well, all across the country, communities affected by right-wing violence are trying to make sense of what they've seen over the past week. Our communities editor, Darshna Soni, has been speaking to people in Nottingham about what they believe is at the root of the rioting and how they are choosing to respond.
1, 2, up, 2, again. They're punching way above their weight here.
I've had no funding, last 4 years I've been doing it all off my own back.
Curtis Valentine's summer holiday club is so popular. On some days he's overwhelmed with the number of children who turn up. The sessions are completely free because most families just can't afford to pay.
People around here got no money, so I just thought put a free event on, get the community together, just try and do something to help out really. 1, 2.
Because they don't want to charge for these sessions, they're having to rely on donations. But times are tough and people are struggling. Over the years, the council has seen huge cuts to its budget. And across this city, youth clubs are closing down. But in recent times, these changes have come to be blamed on immigration. Last Saturday, far-right groups descended here following the Southport stabbings. 15 people were arrested. Today, the city has been on edge, bracing itself for the potential of further unrest. In the park, youth worker Ben Rosser is encouraging people to stay away from any potential trouble spots.
You obviously are seeing what's happening on the news regarding some of these protests and some of the violence, antisocial behaviour that's going on. Just don't go into town. Stay away from town. Keep safe.
I meet Shay Michael and his friends who tell me what it's been like over the last few days.
All over Snapchat, people can screenshot the dates of DDL marches, and there's a lot of them going around now. Some are fake, some are real.
I've got a lot of friends that aren't my colour, my religion, or anything, and
but people are trying to sow that division.
Yeah.
They're frustrated, they say, because the real problems on this estate are being ignored.
Once you hit 16, you can't really go anywhere. There's no youth clubs for you because your class is too old. So then you just start hanging around on your ends.
They don't understand where we're from. Around here, nothing's really handed to you, and you have to strive a lot and work a lot. And, your mum's working 2 shifts and your dad's not coming in until 1 in the morning because he's had to work from the day before. So I feel like it's important that people realise it's not immigrants, it's not the EDL, it's nothing to do with that, it's people.
Like a number of councils, Nottingham declared itself effectively bankrupt last year. It announced massive cuts to jobs and services and a 5% rise in council tax. One of the community centres still struggling is the Pythian Hub, where I dropped in on its Knit and Natter Club.
When you pull it through, you put that through again.
Right.
Pull it through those two.
Pensioners Elizabeth, Rachel and Alison say this is one of the few places left for them to meet.
There's no local bus. There's no local groups for the children at all.
They've also been warned not to go into town today because of the potential disorder. They've been following the news and in particular the debate about immigration.
I've got sons and they can't get a house. They can't get a council house. And that winds me up quite a bit. That really does wind me up. Come from somewhere else where there's war and all that. Yeah, they've got to go somewhere. And but our families, our children need somewhere.
The council would argue that all of their homes got sold off, not enough have been built.
Yeah.
And it's nothing to do with immigration because asylum seekers can't get on the housing list anyway.
Right. I didn't know that.
Do you feel comfortable talking about it, or do you feel like if you try and talk about immigration,
maybe somebody else?
I don't mind talking like that, but I would never put anything on Facebook. Never. Ever.
No.
Why is that?
Because I don't feel comfortable with it. Because there's famous people who've been cancelled. I don't want to be cancelled. I ain't got that many friends anyway. So, yeah.
Like other cities, there have been many changes here. Industries have declined, austerity has hit hard. And whilst there's always been a sense of unity in adversity, that unity is being challenged by the events of the last week.
Well, I'm joined here in the studio by Bel Ribeiro Addy, Labour MP for Clapham and Brixton Hill, and Samuel Kasumu, a former special advisor to Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And we're also joined by the writer and journalist Satnam Sanghera, who's author of Empire World, How British Imperialism Has Shaped the Globe. Satnam, let me just begin with you. I mean, do you think we've been clear enough about what it is that is going on? You know, we've seen racial attacks described as anti-immigration protests. It seems very confused.
Yeah, I keep on hearing these disturbances being described as race riots, and the term implies that people of colour somehow have some sort of blame in causing these disturbances when they are caused entirely by white mob violence. And I know something about what it's like to be caught up in one of these so-called race riots. One of my first memories as a kid is of hiding in a Sikh temple as hordes of far-right National Front thugs try to burn down shops and homes in Wolverhampton. And history tells us that we also had so-called race riots in 1958. In 1919, they hit Cardiff and Liverpool and Glasgow and London. And each time, white mobs were attacking people of colour. And each time, there's talk of brown people being blamed, partly for just existing. And it's happening again today with this fearful talk of Asian thugs gathering in Birmingham. Let's call this what it is. These are racist riots. It's racially aggravated violence. These are lynch mobs. And at worst, it's domestic terrorism.
Right. Well, and so, I mean, I can literally feel on social media people going, yeah, but what about the Asian mobs? What about those guys we've seen with weapons? What about the people that they've been attacking? How do you describe that?
If you were living in a community and your house was at threat of being burnt down, if a police station was being burnt down, if your library had been burnt down, you probably would organize and assemble and try to protect your community from that threat. But when Asian people gather, it's a gang. But when white thugs gather, seemingly it's a protest.
OK, Samuel Kasumu, I mean, we've seen Robert Jenrick, Conservative leadership contender, accused today of stirring things up. Do you think politicians on the right have stirred things up over time with their talk about immigration, stopping the boats and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, you know, it was Margaret Thatcher that once said that the rule of law must prevail over the rule of the mob. There's absolutely no justification for some of the behaviour that we've seen over the recent days and recent times. Having said that, it is also clear that there are millions of people who feel disenfranchised and are genuinely concerned by the levels of immigration, or actually I would say the seeming lack of control of our immigration system in this country, right? You know, in 2015, 3.8 million people voted for UKIP, right? In 2019, the reason why the Conservatives ended up with a majority was because of this idea of taking back control. And now when reform ends up with millions of votes again, that's partly why Labour have their majority. So there are genuine concerns, but those concerns have nothing to do with and are not a justification for the behaviours that...
But do you see a correlation between Boris Johnson and then Rishi Sunak saying stop the boats and then racist rioters who attack people shouting stop the boats?
Of course, not just Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson, but also, of course, Nigel Farage, who is, you know, a pound shop Enoch Powell in many respects, stirring up hatred on our streets, flaring up. The flaring up we're seeing is people who are essentially ignorant and are finding ways to express themselves that are completely abhorrent. But of course, our political system and our politicians have a part to play, and not just Conservatives, by the way, because if you look at the Labour Party right now, you know, what are their ideas and policies around how we control our borders? They have absolutely none. And so there has not been a credible response to some of the worries that people have, despite the behaviours not being justified.
I suppose we should just say Nigel Farage would dispute the characterisation. He's not here to defend himself because he doesn't often appear on Channel 4 News. Bell.
These are not genuine concerns. And I think the biggest issue is that they're not called out as being not genuine concerns. And I have to say, the Labour Party have been in power for, 4 weeks now? The Conservatives were in power for 14 years. And for 14 of those years, every time they failed at something, they scapegoated migrants, they scapegoated Muslims, they went along with this whole kind of rhetoric that we see, unfortunately, peddled in the media and peddled by other far-right parties. You mentioned Reform, you mentioned UKIP, which keeps blaming the other for all of the things that they have done wrong. People say you need to address people's concerns. When you talk to people who are spouting racist filth, you also almost always hear them talking about resources. They're talking about why they can't get housing, they're talking about the NHS, they're talking about school places, they're talking about the cost of living crisis. And then they're saying that the reason why they believe what they do about immigrants and migrants and people seeking asylum is because they believe that they are taking away from them. So that is a lie, and politicians should be challenging that. The media should be challenging that. Instead, over the years, we've seen that peddled.
So why do you think the government is not making that argument? Right now, the government's response to this is very narrow. It is a law and order issue. They will stop the thugs. They will lock them up. And they're not addressing any of that stuff that you and a few others
I wouldn't say they're not addressing it at all, because we have heard them talk about racism and we have heard them talk about, discriminating against Muslims. Obviously, our communities would like them to go further. I think it's very, very clear they need to call it out quite specifically as racist and Islamophobic violence. That's what we need to hear, because the problem at the moment is that people think that type of behaviour is justified, and that's why they're being treated as if they have genuine concerns and they're allowed to behave in this way.
Samuel?
Yeah, I think that these are two separate points, and it's very difficult to make them distinct. And so on one side, there is no justification for acts of aggression towards anyone in society, right? That's a full stop. And the police officers are rightly operationally independent, and they need to focus on containing the issue. But there is a separate point, which is actually how do we deal with the migration question in a way that is mature and informative? The reality,
if you legitimise racism and scapegoating migrants, people will think that this way of behaving is a legitimate way to respond.
The reality is, under Conservative administration, I'm not blaming Labour for this, 1.2 million people arrived on these shores last year, the last year of official figures. Now, by any stretch of their imagination, in any country, that would be considered mass migration. Now, if there are people who feel like their voices are not being heard, the majority of those people, by the way, arrived here legally and not on boats, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so
they were invited quite a few of them.
exactly, they answer the call, just like the Windrush generation, etc. But if there are legitimate reasons around how and why we have the levels of migration that we have, then our politicians need to do a better job at articulating.
Let me just bring in Satnam again. I mean, there's a chicken and egg question here, isn't there? If politicians bang on about immigration all the time, funnily enough, people start worrying about immigration. Or was it a worry that people had that politicians responded to?
Well, I would say this as a historian. I think we need to go further back. And I think we have a very successful multicultural society in Britain, largely because of the British Empire. But we also have a long and deep legacy of brutal racial violence, which also has something to do with the British Empire. When fascism first appeared in Britain, the British fascists weren't inspired by Mussolini or the Nazis. They were inspired by the great bastards of the British Empire. They were inspired by people like General Dyer, who murdered hundreds of Indians at the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. And if we are to face up to this problem in British society, as I argue in Empire World, my new book, we need to face up to the dark history.
Well, what does that involve?
Involves education. I mean, every time we have a crisis about racism in this country, there's an official report. There's a report after Windrush, after the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, and both of those reports said we need to teach our kids about the deep links between Britain and the British Empire. And each time, the lessons of those reviews are not implemented. So we finally need to teach the history of British Empire in our schools.
Just very briefly, I mean, do you think this can be stopped from happening again?
It absolutely has to be stopped from happening again, and we're only going to do that, as Satnam said, through education and through making sure that we're making very clear arguments about what is happening in the country and not scapegoating migrants. They are not the cause for economic failures.
Yeah, I think history has a funny way of repeating itself, and the challenge is not necessarily just learning about the past, but also trying to have a constructive conversation about the future. What are the trade-offs around some of the things that people are really worried about, particularly around migration? There are reasons, as you said, Belle, why the level of migration in the UK is at the level that it is, but you have to deal with some of those structural problems and failure
have to take responsibility.
And politicians don't take responsibility.
Well, they absolutely have to.
Conservative or Labour. If you read the Labour manifesto that you stood on, there's absolutely nothing to do with how you have a credible immigration policy that people understand and that you can justify.
You can't say that.
Migration will go up in the coming years.
We will come back. We will come back and do more of this. But for now, Samuel Kasumu, Belle Ribeiro Addy, Satnam Sangera, thank you all very much.